Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm thrilled to have our guest on today, Dr. Lynn Swaner with Cardus US. Lynn, thank you so much for being with us. This is really a full circle moment because when the Herzog Foundation started just 3.5 years ago, the board told our president, Daryl Jones, and I just to start listening and checking out what's going on in the sector. Where are there gaps, but where's the momentum? And some of the very first work that I read was your work with Flourishing Schools and Mindshift and many of the research projects that you've been putting out. So it's a joy to be having this conversation with you today. Would you just share a little bit about your background and what you're doing now with Cardus?
Sure. It's wonderful to be here, Sadie. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's great to spend some time with you and to be here at the foundation and to actually physically get to visit the place that is blessing so many Christian schools and really helping to advance the sector. So my background, originally I started out as a higher education professor and researcher. I followed my kids into Christian school and so worked on the academic side, helped to do accreditation and sort of move some of the programs forward. Ended up working with ACSI, which is the largest Christian school association in the US and in the world, and was their chief strategy and innovation officer for about 8 years. So worked on research, thought leadership, and then started in January of 2024 with Cardus. I had served for about 5 years as a Cardus Senior Fellow, and Cardus is an independent faith-based think tank which is primarily headquartered in Canada, but has some pretty extensive U.S. involvement and engagement. And so looking at North America writ large, and education, of course, is one of their large portfolios with a particular emphasis on Christian education.
And what an exciting time for this work and just in general to be in the Christian education space. I've been so encouraged by different partners and trends in leadership. Obviously, the sector was disrupted about 4 years ago with COVID. And you've been doing research prior to COVID in the Christian school sector and now since COVID. Can you share some of the trends that you're seeing, some things that maybe we should be aware of as leaders in Christian education?
So obviously the pandemic was in business, we would call it a black swan event, right? It's one of the things that comes along probably once in a lifetime. Certainly nothing like that has happened in the history of modern education. And so one of the fascinating things about the pandemic is, people have talked about, are we bouncing back? Are we back to normal? And certainly there's been a lot of shifts back to what we would consider pre-pandemic education. But a lot of the choices that families made during the pandemic, some of those have actually stuck. Mm-hmm. And different sectors are continuing to grow. In the independent school world, for example, and homeschooling. And so to me, that suggests that I like to talk a lot about mental models. So we have mental models of different things. Mm-hmm. So if you think of what's home, you have a mental model. A lot of us have a mental model for schooling. And you can think about that. That hasn't changed a lot in the last 100 or so years. And so the pandemic actually disrupted that model for many families. Mm-hmm. So schooling during that time did not look like what they were used to, what their children were used to. Of course, that's very distressing in some ways, but also it creates the possibility for imagination and for thinking about something differently that honestly probably was not widely questioned. Of course, there's always been home educators and people doing alternative forms of education, but writ large for families really all over the world to think differently about education for the first time. So I think that is probably what we're going to continue to see, an awakening of possibilities for families, and I think that that's really exciting. I also think that, and this is interesting because I think in the Christian school sector, we've always focused on a broad range of outcomes. Mm. So it's never just been about one thing, whatever that one thing might be. But most of the world, educational sectors really focus, and schools focus on academic outcomes and often measured very, very narrowly. Mm-hmm. So for example, standardized test scores, and those are important. But they don't really tell us what's happening with students as they go through their education in a really robust way. So there's this concept in the Bible, so it's in 12 translations, 33 instances of the word flourishing. So you mentioned flourishing. And it's this sense of life in all its fullness. So when Jesus gives his mission statement in John 10:10b and says, I've come that they may have life and have it to the full. And the word there is Zoe in the Greek. And it's this fullness of life in every possible dimension. So cognitive, social, spiritual, everything you could think about. And so Jesus is saying his mission statement is that we would have that fullness of life. And the question is, how do we do that educationally? So I think this actually is a moment for Christian schools to lean in on their holistic outcomes, because not only will that benefit their own students, but also the world's watching and saying, our schools, our educational systems are failing. First of all, academically, not producing the academic outcomes. But then also we have students that are struggling at unprecedented levels with mental health. Students who are graduating and not able to really function in a workplace environment or having the skills that employers desire. So I think this is the moment for the Christian education sector to say, hey, we've been looking at these holistic outcomes for a while. We're doubling down, we're leaning in and asking what that educational life in all its fullness looks like.
So that concept's very interesting to me, especially from the Herzog Foundation's perspective of, we started in 2021 when the dust of COVID was just settling. And so I sensed a lot of fear, or maybe just the sense of the unknown. And I think one trend we're seeing is leaders seeing this disruption as a huge opportunity. And that's what you're saying too. It's an opportunity to be willing to innovate and be willing to be entrepreneurial with our schools, because the one-size-fits-all educational classroom model is not necessarily what parents are looking for anymore, which is exciting and from a mind shift change of the parents' mental models. But at the same time, use this as an opportunity, like you were saying, to really understand all of the outcomes that we're after, not just academically. We say this all the time. There's a reason we call ourselves Christian schools, and if Christian's going to be our school's middle name, what does that mean from a character and spiritual formation standpoint? So I'm excited to see how schools continue to use this disruption as an opportunity to thrive. So that's really wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is the moment to be in education. This is the moment. We had a lot of people when Mindshift came out in 2019 that said, this is really interesting. It's challenging. I need to kind of think about it. And during the pandemic, we had people call and email and say, I was thinking about it in 2019. I'm living it now.
Yes.
And so maybe a little bit of a prophetic voice, if you will, in terms of these trends started before the pandemic accelerated them.
Yeah. So talking about flourishing, one of the ways that we define success for school, homeschool, any type of educational organization is both internal and external, right? So internally, organizational health, but typically what we promote as success is growing enrollment numbers, increased donor revenue, student academic outcomes. Those are some of the metrics that we hear a lot of when we're trying to report on success at the school or homeschool level. But flourishing can't happen unless you have it internally as well, with our people inside the walls of our schools. Can you talk about some of the research you've been doing on flourishing as it pertains to well-being?
Sure. So, I think referencing the Flourishing Schools research, which started back in 2018. So to date, there's been over 150,000 people who've participated in that across well over 400 schools around the world. And that instrument, the Flourishing School Culture Instrument, looks at 7 different constituent groups. So you've got students, parents, teachers, boards, support staff, and alumni. And so you've got a really robust sense, and of course school leaders. So you've got a really robust sense of what's going on in the school. So even back in 2018, stress was a significant issue for teachers and for leaders. And resilience and healthy living were real challenges for students. So that's very much pre-pandemic. There's also some interesting research that came out of the University of Maryland in 2017 And the title was something like, why school mental health is not just for students. It really matters for teachers and staff as well. And what they found, again, this is in 2017, is that teachers reported being at the highest level of professional stress. About half of teachers were there. What that means is the same level of stress as EMTs, as frontline nurses in emergency rooms. So, trauma specialists, the same level, about half of teachers at the time were feeling that. Again, pre-pandemic, close to 80% of teachers were reporting that they were emotionally exhausted every single day. Not once in a while, every single day. 80% of teachers in different sectors. So that's incredible. Again, back in 2017.
Right.
And why does this matter, right? We can say education's always been, tough profession, stressful profession. Many professions are. Well, the reason why it matters is because there's very solid research that shows that teacher stress is actually correlated with lower student gains, lower sense of student self-efficacy, and even student stress themselves. And this makes a lot of sense, right? If you have a stressed out teacher, that is going to impact their students. So that's why it matters. It's not secondary. It's like, okay, well, we're focused on outcomes, and if we get to wellness, great.
Right.
Actually, there's this correlation. There's an interesting study that was done a few years back in the Christian school setting in North America and also in a few countries abroad that showed that teacher burnout was reversely correlated with practicing Sabbath. And that's loosely defined, so it's not saying a 24-hour period. There are different theological views on this. But when teachers practice Sabbath in some way, when the school has some Sabbath practices itself around rest, this can look like not having tests on Mondays or not having events on Sundays, that kind of thing. Burnout is significantly reduced. So I think a lot of times we think about well-being as an individual construct. It's something that you're responsible for your well-being, I'm responsible for my well-being, and that is absolutely true. But what often happens in schools is that the things that are causing people stress, and this is true for teachers as well as students, are actually environmental or structural in the school. And those have to be system changes that are made. So a classic example of this is the schedule. The daily schedule, right? Yes. So when I was in school, when I started in Christian schools, you had like 7 32-minute periods and 4 minutes between each, so kids are kind of running around. And that's not healthy for people, like either in terms of cognitively or just rest and being able to focus. So we've moved in a lot of schools towards more block scheduling, but how are we using those? Are we giving time for rest and breaks and creativity? Do we have times in our schedule where teachers can take a walk? Do we encourage outside learning? So all these types of questions. And so what I recommend to schools is to do a wellness audit. So we talk about this in the Flourishing Together book, where you gather across constituent groups. So that can be parents. The schools add a lot of stress to parents. Yes. I can say as a parent, there's different things that cause family stress even. So bringing families into the conversation, students, staff, teachers, leaders, and do this wellness audit. Ask some good questions. Where are the pain points? What's stressing you out the most? Sort of take that holistic look. And you're not going to be able to address everything, but I will say if you don't know where your pain points are, you definitely can't address them.
Yes, that's so good. And I think too, understanding what our priorities are as a school and really having a robust understanding of even what the product that we're providing as educational institutions is. Oftentimes I get schoolers who say the product of our schools are students. And obviously we are working towards their academic and spiritual success. But there are so many factors that play into that the school cannot control. What the school provides is the best culture and adult culture in which the students can thrive and flourish in. So it kind of turns the even business model of our schools on its head to say, no, flourishing and well-being of our staff is our product. Like, that's what we are providing to the families that we serve. And I think that's helpful too, because as school leaders, we have to be willing to kill a sacred cow sometimes, or to question the status quo. One of our coaches, who I know you're familiar with, Dr. Alan Pugh, he talks about how sacred cows make the best hamburgers. and he goes into depth on that with some of our trainings. And I think it's just so important that we get this right. What are some of the practices? So you mentioned outside learning and walks. What are some of the successful practices you've seen on this?
So I'll get into that in a second, but I just want to echo this and say this is one of the issues with the pandemic is never waste a good crisis. Mm-hmm. So we're still in that kind of fungible period where we can experiment more than we have in schools, perhaps in the past, where parents are concerned about well-being. I was just reading an HBR article the other day about how in the corporate world, HR offices used to be about, and units used to be about cost cutting. Now it's about creating wellness experiences, like authentic, not just, hey, we have a wellness program, but actually what does that look like? So I think we're still in that moment where schools can experiment and do different things around this. So some of those things that I've seen would be a rest policy. What does this actually look like? And of course, you're not going to get stressed out and be incredibly rigid about it, but what does it look like to make sure that we are having rest in our schools, knowing that rest looks very different for different people. So for some people, rest could be running a 5K, right? That would be incredibly stressful for other people. I've had this conversation with educators where if things are sort of amiss in their world, they'll clean. So this looks different for different people, right? Some people need a nap, and
Absolutely,
I think
I assure you, I'm not cleaning when I'm stressed out.
That's a different breed of folks, so just these different ways of resting. So how do you look at that in your school? How do you have that policy? I talk about in the Flourishing Together book, and this is a little bit pushing the story, the biblical narrative, but where Jesus is walking through with his disciples the fields on the Sabbath, and they're plucking the heads of the grain, which of course is work on the Sabbath. And of course the Pharisees take note of this and start condemning him and saying, why do you do this work on the Sabbath? And Jesus has this fascinating response. And he said, the Sabbath was created for man. Man was not created for the Sabbath. And then after that, he says, and, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. So we often focus on that because it's a declaration of who Jesus is. But we miss the first part, which is we were not created for the law. The law was created for us, to serve us. And this is a sacred cow in a lot of schools, which is your schedule, your daily schedule, your yearly schedule. Those things should be serving us, not the other way around. And so to sort of start interrogating that, again, with a group of constituents, I've heard some interesting stories from schools about they've restructured their calendar so that they have cyclical days off for instead of those sort of large breaks where a certain number of weeks go by and they won't have school for a couple of days. And those are not even staff development. It's just everybody, this is a rest time. So that's another practice that I've seen.
We've got a partner of ours who's starting a 4-day-a-week school, a small Christian school, and they're intentionally taking Mondays off so that families can be together. And as a part of their community, they're encouraging shared meals on Sundays. And that can be a lot of work, cooking, cleaning, hosting. So they're encouraging the shared meals on Sundays for community. And then Mondays is your rest and recovery day. And I just love the models of being able to question and, again, really understand, okay, what are our priorities, and what we say our priorities are our practices aligning with that? I think of books that we recommend to our leaders, anything from, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry to The Common Rule by Justin Earley. And I'm struck by the fact that Jesus' ministry was 3 years. And how many times did he go away and pray? He went, and fasted, and he went to just be with the Lord, or he was resting while the disciples were worried and stressed out. And so I'm struck by if we take Jesus as the example and ask our schools, okay, is what we say we're after really, truly the habits of our community?
There's another great, those are all excellent books. Another great book is called You're Only Human.
Okay.
So it's written by a Christian author, and he talks about the limits of creation, that we have actually been, if you even before the fall, we were created with limits. And that's a good thing. We are not God. Yeah. We have these physical limits. We have cognitive limits, emotional limits. And a lot of times, this is where we surpass our limits, not by pushing ourselves or anything like that, but by working together as a community, like supplying where there's lack. You said it's a lot of work to host a meal. And I was thinking of that saying, many hands make the work light. So how do we lift one another up in community? We live in for the most part, very individualistic societies that really prize sort of that, I can do this on my own. Yeah. And how are we functioning like that in our little siloed classrooms, right? Or in our siloed schools even. So the idea of even breaking down walls between schools to come alongside one another, because we can't do it on our own. And if we do it on our own, we will be burnt out.
Yes.
So our limits are there for a reason. That's how we're created. But I think one of the reasons so we would also be in community with one another and be reliant and interdependent together.
That's good. Well, for our watchers and our listeners, I apologize for your book budget, but there's a handful of books that are just so rich on this topic. So last kind of comment here on this, something that I've been convicted about even in my work, Lynn, as well as leading leaders through our professional development series and really prioritizing time of rest, time of connection, is this idea that our work is our vocation, is our ministry. And so, it feels worth it, right? To just burn the candle at both ends because we're doing good work. And then you start to see little consequence after little consequence of how that affects us. And so I just want to encourage anybody listening, especially those school leaders, that well-being and the spiritual support of our staff is the heart of it. Right? It's not a secondary, it's not another thing that we're trying to do, but it's really the heart of the schools that we're providing, is that culture and the fact that our staff have the mental and physical capacity to stop what they're doing in the day and have a meaningful missional moment with a child. And if they're burnt out, if they're stressed out, that is not going to have the impact that we want it to have. So
there's a really great quote from C.S. Lewis from God in the Dock, and I love this. So you think back when C.S. Lewis was writing, right? And most of our Christian school leaders and teachers love C.S. Lewis. And he says something to the effect of, one generation cannot bequeath to the next that which it has not got. Nothing can flow from the teachers to the pupils that the teachers do not themselves possess. And we think about Jesus' teaching, when a student is fully formed, they'll be like their master teacher. Yeah. And that principle exists, and for us to ignore that is actually not only to our own peril as the adults, but also is really shortchanging our students.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about one more trend in education that I think is stressing a lot of people out. Recently, Cardus and ACSI came out with a research study on AI. Can you talk to us about this topic? Because, for different generations, this is a very stressful, kind of intimidating topic. So I'm curious, what are the trends that you're seeing, and how can schools really wisely navigate this conversation?
So the first thing I would say is that AI is similar in a lot of ways to previous iterations of technological advances or revolutions that schools have gone through. So if you think about, I'm old enough to remember the internet coming into schools, and then Google Classroom, right? And then, so it's similar in having that kind of disruptive experience, that sense that a lot of educators are having of sort of the ground shaking. And it's similar in that just as schools would have looked to their mission, thoughtfully considered how they would either adapt or adjust or decide they're not going to use this innovation. It's similar in that effect. So I want to start out with that. It's also quite different from other previous technological advances. And if we have this conversation in 5 years, I can guarantee you there'll be something new, whatever it might be. It could be holographic teachers. I don't, whatever it might be. Sci-fi brain implant. Who knows? We can have this conversation in 5 years from now and talk about what it means to be human and have all different kinds of applications then. But it is different because it is conversational. So students can have a conversation with it. So it has this sense of it's kind of human, but it's not really, but you can engage with it in conversational ways. And of course, because it's based on large learning models, it's almost limitless in terms of what it can find and what it can do. And that doesn't mean it's always right. There's quite a high rate of AI hallucination with a lot of the tools that are out there. So there's a lot of potential and a lot of peril as well. Right. So we did the survey because we wanted to know, sort of take a snapshot of what Christian schools are doing, what the responses are. So this was fielded in fall of 2023. And I would say overall, schools are in very early stages of thinking about AI. Only about 18% have implemented any kind of ban. Okay. So that's very interesting. Those schools tend to be covenantal instead of missional. So schools that have a faith requirement for one or more parents versus open admission where they don't have that for their parents. So, but even so, that's a fairly low rate of banning. At the same time, about 30% of educators in our sample said that their schools are formally using AI in instruction. And that tends to be more in the high school grades, as we would imagine. But there's also sort of this, you've got kind of low adoption, still about a third. You've got some banning. But when you look at educator attitudes themselves, very few feel confident in using AI, feel knowledgeable in using AI, and have actually learned how to use it themselves. It's sort of this uneven kind of ground. And we would expect this with a new technology. Then we ask questions about attitudes and beliefs. Yes. It's fascinating. So the bottom line here is that there's two different sets of beliefs or things that you can believe about AI. One is for the educators, the teachers themselves, and one is about students. Okay. Remember, we didn't. I'll talk about students in a minute. We didn't actually survey students here, but what we found is that administrators in general are more positive than teachers when it comes to what is the potential to help students learn. Okay. Teachers are still pretty positive, but administrators tend to be more positive. Teachers express more concern around things like cheating and integrity, around this actually stunting students' ability to learn and be creative, safety issues, challenges in terms of different faith values and things like that. So, but teachers were much more positive around their own use of it. Okay. So they believed it would help them to be more effective in terms of doing work more quickly, reducing workload, and also, frankly, helping students to sort of have personalized, if you will, or individualized instruction. So that's an interesting dichotomy where you have teachers viewing it as this is something actually could help me, but I'm not so sure about it for my students. Okay. And my guess, I don't have the data, but my guess is probably a lot of technological advances have that type of reaction.
You would imagine it's just another disruption, right? And so this has been the theme of pandemic disruption, AI disruption, and it's just navigating that, especially in the world of education where educators tend to be more resistant to change, which kind of, again, is like, how do we approach this wisely? How does this align with our school and our school identity? Because we've seen this in the schools we serve. We have some that are technology free, right? Kids will learn that at the appropriate time if it's a part of the work that they want to go into. And then we have others that are total adoption from early age. And, from our perspective at Herzog, parents are going to choose what's best for their kids, right? And so your Christian school, your homeschool just has to have a philosophy and a theology on this. And so the research that you've done, I think, is helping to inform that in schools and kind of challenge schools to say, this is a reality. This is the new reality. I'm impressed that you did the study so early, right out of the gate in 2023. And this is the new reality. How are you as a school going to navigate it?
Yeah, there's a couple of things I would say, and you're absolutely right. The first I would say, and this is obvious, I think, for parents and for educators, but just to really put a fine point on it, is that there is a difference between having older students engage and having younger. Mm-hmm. So I mentioned student voice. So I've done focus groups at a couple of schools now that are using AI and talk to students who are in high school. Mm-hmm. And they're very aware of some of these challenges. So around, just sort of they could become lazy, the potential for cheating, the impersonal nature of AI. Mm-hmm. They are aware of this, and they're very articulate and self-reflective about it. At the same time, where schools have collected quantitative data around use of AI tools among their students, they're finding that the uptake in younger students, so middle school in particular, is much higher. Okay. And so this it creates an interesting conundrum, mm-hmm. because you have a group of high school students within 4 years who are going to be out, who are used to not learning in this way or more thoughtful about it. And then when we've introduced it at lower grades from middle school and potentially even lower, the potential for it to shape their learning in ways that we might not even be aware mm-hmm. is significantly higher. So I would say when we talk about approaching AI in Christian schools, we are talking about not one size fits all, not even by school, right. but also by age and stage mm-hmm. of kids. So that's really important. But I want to go back to what you said about the possibility and the reality that Christian schools do things differently when it comes to technology. And in an ideal world, and what we would urge schools to do, and what we actually do in the report, is urge them to make decisions thoughtfully. Yeah. And based on their mission. Mm-hmm. So when that happens, it's entirely reasonable that a school might say, we're not even going to have technology in this classroom, exactly what you said. Or another school to say, we're going to actually create an entire online curriculum with an AI tutor that's mm-hmm. available 24/7. Both of those are, in my view, legitimate responses if and only if they really fit the school, yes. if it's been done thoughtfully, if it's been done collaboratively and intentionally. And also I would say too, these things can change over time. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing a reversal with Christian schools in terms of cell phone policies, yes. for example. So one other work that's really important, and we apologize to the viewers for yet another book, is of course Jonathan Haidt's work on the anxious generation. Yes. Right? And we apologize for all the books. My college-age kid just had to help me set up another bookshelf because here goes mom again. But, just sort of understanding shifts in cell phone policies. At one point it was, okay, this is a great potential tool for learning. And a lot of schools are now actually saying, when you come to school, you have to turn in your cell phone. Right. Or we're not even allowing them on campus. It's not even that you can sort of have them on your lap or in your pocket, right? So, all that to say that policies may change over time as we learn and as we grow. And that's where that experimentation, piloting, and really being laser focused on the mission is really important for schools. In the report, we provide a framework to try and help schools to think through this, because a lot of times as I talk with school leaders, they don't know where to start. Mm-hmm. There's so many things to consider.
It's the AI abyss.
Where do you start? So it's just an initial framework of sort of 3 areas that you should think about as a school. And when I say think about, I mean collaboratively. Mm-hmm. So you've got parents, as you mentioned, parents and their choice. They've chosen your school. Mm-hmm. So where are parents in this? Where are students? Where are your teachers, your leaders, et cetera, your board? So getting that group together and then really thinking about 3 areas. The first is use case. So use case is across all industries are asking the question, how do we use AI in a best practice kind of way? So what would this look like in terms of a policy? What would this look like in terms of homework? In terms of maybe putting rubrics so that students could submit first drafts of their paper, AI gives feedback, and then they continue to iterate so that what they hand into the teacher actually is their best work, if you will. Is that allowed? What does that look like, right? So those are use cases. So every school needs to be thinking about those. And I think over the next couple of years, we'll have some really interesting use cases around AI. originally there was a lot of talk around, we might need an education-specific large learning model. And really the way things have shifted are AI tutors and tools that put fences around the large learning models and engage with students in appropriate, maybe Socratic or just ways that the teachers would ask them to do that. So those are starting to proliferate. And I think as time goes on, we'll see more and more that schools will be able to access and be able to choose and maybe customize in ways that work for their school. So that's the use lens. The second is the humanity lens. And we talk a lot about this, right? How does this shape learning? What does it mean to be human? If AI is creating this product or this artwork or whatever it might be, where does that leave me? And our students are going to have to grapple with this, not only in school, but in their future careers. What is unique in terms of how we have been created that only we can do? And then what do we use machines really well for? Right? So those are some interesting questions I think schools have to grapple with. This really connects with their theology, right? How are we created? What are we supposed to be doing? We're made in God's image. It also connects with pedagogy, different approaches to pedagogy. So a school has to be laser focused and know what those are and then ask questions around AI. And then the third is a missions lens. And every Christian school has a different mission. I'm not just talking about what's written in terms of their mission statement, right? We would call that espoused theory or espoused mission. And then there's theory and use or whatever you're using day to day. So sometimes there can be a difference. Hopefully not. Hopefully they're aligned. It's a constant iteration that we have to do and moving towards that. But what is our actual mission as a school? What kind of outcomes do we want to see for students, for our teachers, for our community? How do we want to be our light in a community? How do we think about serving others, loving our neighbor? How do we think about living out the Great Commission? When we think about that, there's implications for how we do or do not incorporate AI into our schools. So I think those three kind of lenses, use case, humanity case, and then the mission case, those can provide, and in the report we give some helpful reflection questions, just some conversation starters for how you can get through this with your school and be thinking in thoughtful, intentional ways about artificial intelligence. And frankly, it's a good exercise. It's a good routine to get yourself in as a school because we don't know what's coming down the pike next. That's right. But if we have that reflective mindset that's mission-focused, that's prayerful, and that's collaborative and cross-constituent, we can set ourselves up well for whatever's down the pike next.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I feel like for leaders who I've talked to that don't know where to start, like you're saying, or feel overwhelmed or anxious about this conversation, that's so helpful and is a good practice, like you said, to put in place on AI, but that's a good practice to put on lots of things that affect our curriculum and our learning environment. So that's great. So I just have one more question for you. This has been a really wonderful and meaningful conversation. I so appreciate your time. I want to talk about, so we've talked about disruptions and trends and well-being and AI. Why is it so important for heads of schools and even for boards of Christian schools to be aware of what's going on in the sector?
That's a great question. So I think a lot of times in Christian schools, we get so caught up in our mission, which is important, as I just was explaining, but we forget that we're part of a larger sector. We forget, we're focused on the word Christian, but we often forget the word school, right? And what impacts larger educational sectors is eventually going to impact us. So what happened in the education sector relative to the pandemic, technology, legal issues, we're not impervious to those. Those are going to somehow impact us. We have to take them into consideration. And what I have found is that leaders who read well, who collaborate with other leaders, who visit other schools, are connected in with networks, and know where to access resources, really take that sort of humble learning posture, and they're continually growing, continually learning, continually improving. A lot of leaders do a really good job of bringing their staff along with them, and they see that as their primary goal. They're creating a culture in the school where there's principled innovation. There's principled change in a direction that the school wants to go. But oftentimes where the missing link is the connection with boards. So I think we've done a really good job, and we need to continue to do a good job in board training of emphasizing a governance board, right? That we're not an operational board. We're doing policy governance. We have one employee, which is the head of school. That's right. And we've done a really good job in many boards of sort of separating, making sure there's, not competing interests and disclosing conflicts and things like that. So I think there's been a lot of progress made. The missing piece, and I wrote a blog post on this called The Missing Piece in Board Governance, is that I think in our desire to prevent boards, and this is a healthy desire, from becoming an operational board that steps into the operations of the school, we sometimes create an unhealthy distance between the board and what's happening in the larger sector. So the board oftentimes is not brought along on that journey of what are the innovations, what are the things we need to be concerned about, what are the trends, how are we thinking about these things? And we kind of assume board members are like this blank slate. The problem is when we don't proactively bring these things in front of board members, they bring something to the table, which is whatever they're reading about education, their own experience as students. That's if their parents, which oftentimes they are, whatever's going on with their student and Mrs. Smith's class or Mr. Jones's class, right? So a lot of corporate boards, and you know this, Sadie, a lot of corporate boards are populated by people who are not from that sector or that industry. And part of their regular board training is to have experts in that industry come and talk to them and say, hey, here's what's going on in this industry. Just be aware of that. And I think that's the missing piece in board governance is, and again, I don't think it needs to be every meeting. I don't think it needs to be, I think there needs to be some healthy conversation around, well, what is our mission? We're not going to be blown about in the wind by every trend, but still we need to be aware of what's happening in the sector. And this is important for a few reasons. Number one, for board health. You want the board to be current. You want them to understand what's going on. It's also important for the relationship between the board and the head of school, because the board will have a better understanding of what the head of school, the decisions that the head is making, or the things that are keeping the head up at night. Right? And also just the general direction of the school to be thoughtfully responsive. And there could be a range of healthy responses to whatever is happening in the sector. And then the final thing I would say is horizon scanning. We don't always know that next challenge that God can change into an opportunity, right? I think about the scripture in Ephesians where, Paul's writing, God is able to do exceedingly more abundantly than we could ever ask, think, or imagine. We don't know what's coming down the pike, but by horizon scanning and being aware and being open to God's leading, there may be an opportunity that will come that Christian schools can take advantage of. And so that prime example is during the pandemic, right? A lot of government schools closed. Your local public school was closed. Christian schools returned. Most Christian schools lost, I think something like, we did a survey at the time, 95% of schools were back with online instruction within 3 or 4 days. And then most were in person the following year. Right. And that was an opportunity that schools that had some knowledge or understanding of online learning or were on different classroom platforms had a much easier time doing that. Again, a problem became an opportunity. So if we're aware of trends, if we're thinking, we're praying, we're trying to discern what's happening in the education sector, God can use that to help position our Christian schools for even greater influence, not only with our existing schools and families, but also to be that light on the hill.
Yeah. Well, Lynn, thank you so much for your time and just for sharing your expertise in a way that school leaders can really take it and apply it to their world. I appreciate you and your work and just the legacy that you're making in Christian education more than you know. And for those of you that have watched, I just want to say thank you for your time. I hope that you found value in this conversation. And I just want to leave you with a final encouragement that we do live in and work in a fast-paced sector. So keep an eye to the trends. We will link to all of the work of Lynn and Cardus below, but also know what we need to hold on to. What, as Christian schools, we stand for, the things that we're not willing to change, And everything else, let's keep an open mind to learn and to grow. Thank you so much for your time.